Welcome, everybody, to Asks in Praxis. And this week's topic, what's new in PowerShell. Those of you who've been here before realize that this is like half podcast, half call-in show. So we want you for the interactive parts. The team is wonderful, but today is the Todd show, so I probably just should have left the picture of Todd here.
I see nothing wrong with that.
We're gonna talk PowerShell and using it, how to automate things, and Todd's going to lead us through all the recently released goodness and updates in PowerShell. So here's our agenda for the day. As you know, walking in, you caught the witty banter part of the day, I think. Don't blink or you'll miss it. Some pearls of wisdom from Todd. Absolutely don't blink or you'll miss those, because they're
fleeting,
pretty fleeting and infrequent. And then Todd will give us a final blessing and dismissal. So what that actually means is why and when would I use PowerShell? Some of us are IT pros, some of us are developers, some of us are site builders and configurators, but there's some goodness there for each of us. And we'll talk about, you can use a little PowerShell or you can automate all the things, and there's value all up and down the maturity model line that we'll talk through, and then some recent announcements and updates. And with that, I'll flip it to Todd, and we'll talk about why do I care, Todd? Why would I use PowerShell?
Yeah, well, the real reason, and I didn't put it on the slide, is because it just makes you a cooler person. I mean, it puts a little extra spring in your step, helps you dance a little better, just all around a better person when you use PowerShell.
Makes food taste better.
Yeah. So that's the real reason, and I think I am a product of all of that. Those of you who knew me before PowerShell can attest to all that. But the reason I had to put on the slides was it is the thing when I talk about people using PowerShell, I'm like, the cloud is really big, and that seems silly, but when we start working things into the cloud, we have a lot more sites than we're used to having on-prem and all that, and just all the things that we have to iterate through. And so automating everyday tasks is just part of the job. It's the DevOps thing. And so I found kind of the key things there, reliability, and knowing that, the interface is going to be the same and the job on the other side is going to be the same. Makes it really easy to repeat. That up arrow key just always works. And then the hope that you're doing the same thing every time. And I know when I'm fighting around in the UI, I cannot always remember where I went to. Yesterday, Emily and I were looking for a setting. We were both looking for the same setting, and we went at it completely two different ways, because that's just how UIs are. And so having PowerShell, you have a reliable way to do it. The other thing that I like about it is that it's built-in documentation. So, when the lottery becomes worth our time, and my wife has decided that's about $400 or $500 million, it's really not worth it anything below that. She plays the lottery, and I expect at some point we will win, and I will go off and never see you all again. And so I know that my PowerShell code that I leave behind will be documentation of all the processes that I did, because it's inherent there, because nobody documents well enough. So for me, PowerShell has just made my job a lot easier, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. I don't know.
Todd, did you just say the thing that every person who's not a developer just dreads hearing is, my code is self-documenting?
Well, in my case, it is. I mean, I think
okay.
Having inherited Todd's PowerShell code before, I can safely say it is well documented.
And mostly, so I would like to say that's because I'm a great human and considerate and all of that, but it's really because I can never remember what the hell I did from 1 minute to the next. So those notes are really just for me and the fact that Derek benefited from them. Yeah, so it's really great stuff. Though I've heard arguments that if you have to document your code that way, it's probably not good code, but my code's not good code, so seems consistent. I don't know.
Julia's biting through her lower lip until there's a trickle of blood going down her chin, actually. So
she might have been the one that said that. I don't remember.
Just maybe.
Yeah. No, it's very good. And it's in practice. Last week at some point, we saw a GitHub article, and I don't want to call anybody out, but it was this whole thing where somebody was saying, PowerShell, people that use PowerShell are developers, blah, blah, blah. They should do this, that, and the other. And as a person who is in PowerShell every day, I disagree. And I disagree because of, structure and all that kind of thing. And so I don't think of PowerShell as actual code. It's like code for little kids, code for dummies. I don't know. So
that debate, though, we could do a half hour on that alone, right? That's up there with the hot dog is a sandwich and Die Hard's a Christmas movie, right? I mean, that's PowerShell people.
Yeah.
It's a scripting language. It doesn't matter whether it's code or not. It gets stuff done.
Yeah.
Yeah, but by inherently in that statement, JavaScript is a scripting language. So
It's true. It's true. Everything is code. If you have to, if you can't explain it, if you have to explain it to your mother when she reads it, then it's code.
Well, I have to explain some books to my mother, so I don't know that works.
So then one of the other things we've got on this slide is, what are some of the places that we use it? And this is one of my least favorite parts of this deck is where other people get to talk. And so this is, when we were doing the prep for this, they were like, well, what other things can we do? Because one of the reasons that you have to use PowerShell is because when Microsoft introduces new functionality or settings or whatever to Office 365, the interface for that is always PowerShell first. So any new things that come out, site designs of site scripts and hubs and all that kind of stuff, it always came out in PowerShell first. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's frustrating. One of the reasons is they don't have to worry about interface. They don't have to worry about where it goes on the page and how it fits and flows and all those things that Emily does. They don't have to worry about any of that with PowerShell. And also they don't have to worry about languages. So they can just quickly get that setting out there. So if you ever want to take advantage of new things inside of PowerShell or inside of Office 365, you need to be comfortable enough with PowerShell to be able to do those things. And so the list below was some of those things that you can only do in PowerShell without being a real good scripter. So Emily, Mark, do you guys want to talk about some of those that you've leveraged?
So I've done the first 5. And I will say, when it comes to things like that SharePoint home site or the root site swap, or even just deploying a site theme, I think those are very easy for entry-level PowerShell. I'd put them at the 100 level. Site designs and PNP provisioning templates get a little bit more complicated. But again, as someone who doesn't define themselves as a developer and doesn't spend a lot of time in code, I've still found that to be something that I can learn and explore and is incredibly useful.
A lot of that and a lot of the simpler stuff, and Emily and I do tend to live in the simpler end of what Todd's talking about. There are recipes out there, right? So you can find the recipe for how do you turn your root site into a communication site that happens to be a SharePoint home site. So you don't actually have to understand the code, but you ought to, right? It's whenever you copy something off the internet, including from Todd's blog, you want to make sure that you understand what it is it's doing, because you can potentially cause yourself some pain.
Yeah.
I think, well, in addition to these things, Todd, your example of like whenever something new comes out from Microsoft, the default answer or the default question from a lot of our clients is, how do I turn this off? Right? the app panel that's coming out in March, right? It's going to conflict with global navigation if you've built your own. And the question is, how do I turn off the app panel? And the answer usually from Microsoft is with PowerShell, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll interrupt Todd. Oh, that was fun.
Feels great.
Greg asked if the MS Online commandlets would start to be retired as everything moves to PNP PowerShell. My comment was that, well, the MS Online PowerShell is really maintained and created by Microsoft, where the PNP PowerShell is a community effort. But if you had another opinion, I'll let you give it.
Yeah. So, and I wasn't watching the chat. I'm sorry. The MS Online module has already been deprecated by Microsoft. So like Julie said, it's from Microsoft. It's been replaced by the Azure AD module. And there's actually 2 of them for maximum confusion. The MS Online one does usury things and Azure AD things. And then they replaced it with the Azure AD module and then decided to replace that one with the Azure AD preview module. It's all very confusing. But I will tell you that MS Online module still works. I've used it within the last week to do things. At some point, I think the underpinnings, identity, the ADOL, MSOL thing and all those kind of things will make that module not work anymore. But the direct replacement for that one is the Azure AD module.
Julie, did we talk the other day about, do we need to talk about differentiating between when you use the command line interface versus PowerShell?
You mean the
No, it came
CLI?
up. The CLI, yeah.
Yeah, so that's another community project. So up until very, very recently, this Microsoft 360 or the CLI for Microsoft 365 was the only way that you could, well, it was the easy way that you could issue commands if you weren't on a Windows machine, because PowerShell up until very recently was Windows only. And so now the PowerShell, there's ways, and the newest version of PnP PowerShell is cross-platform supported, cross-platform, but the CLI has taken off, and it's also part of the Azure. I don't know the details of this, so I'm sort of speaking without really knowing what I'm talking about, but there's an Azure admin console that the CLI is automatically installed in, so you can just start issuing those commands. So it's kind of powerful and cool, but it's just different. It's just different. It doesn't, not necessarily better or worse, it's just different.
So you're talking about the Azure Cloud Shell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah, so that's another interesting thing. So Azure has a Cloud Shell that anybody can use, and that the platform for that can be, some Linux Bash or whatever, or it can also be PowerShell. And now that everything runs on that version of PowerShell, you can bring PnP into that as well. But that gives you an environment that's ephemeral, so you don't have to worry about installing things and screwing stuff up, and it will just have all your things. So that's a good place to start too. I'd forgotten about that.
Can we talk good, better, best in PowerShell?
Yeah.
We flipped to that. Sorry, I was toggled elsewhere. Here we go.
Yeah. So this was something, those of you who are frequent visitors to the Ask Simpraxis forum know that we really like the maturity model and how to look at technology that way. And so that was one of the things as we were preparing for this, whoever asked Mike, Emily, if there was such a thing for PowerShell. And I'm like, probably. And then it occurred to me that for as long as I've been teaching PowerShell, I've always talked about it in that way. I just didn't have the words. I didn't know that I was talking about the maturity model. So I've talked about the crawl, walk, run approach to PowerShell. And the next slide's got it broken down a little bit more. The reason that I like, the reason that I bring that up is because, like any scripting language, programming language, just getting over that first hump of being able to do anything with it is really tough. And so I bring this up because I want people to know that that's okay. Like, we expect the first time you touch PowerShell to just completely not know what you're doing. And the story I like to tell about that is I didn't PowerShell at all until 2009 when Microsoft released the first beta of SharePoint 2010, and they said, hey, we've got great news. STS ADM is being replaced by PowerShell. And I remember at the time thinking, well, that's terrible because I'm not smart enough for PowerShell, so I got to go find another job, changing tires or sweeping sidewalks or something. And so I decided to learn PowerShell, and one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got was find something that you already know how to do and then figure out how to do it in PowerShell. And the idea there is that way you're only fighting the language. You're not fighting the language and the task. And so the task that I chose to do that was creating a new site collection in SharePoint 2010. Something I'd done a million times in Central Admin and done with STS ADM. Took me about an hour that first time because I just didn't understand anything about PowerShell or what the hell a PS1 file was. I remember asking a buddy of mine, how do I make a PS1 file? Because I thought it was something that I had to open inside of an application. He's like, I don't know, Notepad? Like, well, I don't care. It was, so, I just had every one of those. And again, it took me an hour to create a site collection, something that would, but that was where I started, and that's okay. And that's expected. And just because you have that trouble at the beginning is no way indicative of how your journey is going to be.
And then once you're out of that beginner mode, Todd.
Yeah. So I like to talk about the 100 level for the maturity model is you do everything in the UI, but you keep seeing this PowerShell thing. Like a buddy of mine reached out to me yesterday. He had an Exchange Online thing, but he's like, I have this question and it says to use PowerShell, but I don't know. Roughly you type a word somewhere, but I don't know. That's kind of number one. You know the process, but you don't have the tool. So number two, moving up a little bit, is knowing enough that that's the tool that you want to use, and maybe type in a single command to do a thing. So my site collection example is a good one where there's just a command, new SP site. And so I knew that I could run that command. And if I tried real hard, I could get the right set of parameters and actually get the thing that I wanted at the end. And that was all I could do. Like there was no more thought behind it. And then once I did that a couple of times, I could do a get SP site, and I could see those new SP web, so on and so forth. But it really is usually just a single command at a time. And like I put on there, almost always copying that command from somebody else's, a blog or something like that, and putting it into Notepad. And all right, they say here, this says HR. I want the title to be IT. Just that's level 2. And I see some of the old timers, Sherman and Patrick in the chat talking about STS-ADM. Oh, those were the good old days.
Old timers.
So that's kind of what I think of as that next level, just being comfortable dropping a command here. So the app bar that you talked about, that could be somebody's move from number 1 to number 2, where they're like, this Microsoft released this terrible thing. How do I shut it off? I have to run this one command that does the thing. That can be level 2.
Sorry, I advanced to level 3 already, Todd. So
you
now
did?
we figured out how to do one thing, or like me, a script kiddie. I can grab somebody's script and with adult supervision run it.
Yeah.
What comes next?
Yeah, so the next one is figuring out what this pipeline thing is, or maybe, cracking that code and figuring out how to create these elusive PS1 files you've been hearing so much about, and chaining things together and doing more things. So now maybe you create that new SP site and you add something to it, or you add a user, or you copy it out to a CSV file so you can, keep track of it. Something like that. It's understanding that it's more, now you're thinking of big goals and processes. Now it's not just a single job to get done. And at this point, also still probably copying it off of somebody's blog or documentation somewhere, something like that. Mark mentioned earlier that you should always know what you're running before you run anybody's code anywhere. And yes, for God's sakes, before you run any of my code. And that is one of those things that we will tell you at every level, but you're not always going to be able to do. And this is where level 3 is where that really starts to show up. You're like, oh, I see what they're doing. They're whatever this $sign thingy is, they keep using that. Oh, it makes, that starts to come into a little better focus for you. But usually I think of level 3 is, more a process as opposed to a task. Yeah, and for 4 and 5, this is where I kind of think about being proactive. So we've talked about, the previous ones were, how do I shut off the new app bar? How do I create a site and do some things? Those are all reactive things. So one of the hallmarks of moving up the level a little bit is being proactive. So going out and doing things like grabbing audit logs, or, checking permissions at sites, making sure that IT can still get in, things like that. And also when I start looking at like level 5, I start thinking of things like, are you writing functions instead of PS1 files? Are you putting error checking in? This is Don Jones, for a long time, was a PowerShell MVP and kind of one of the guys that guided where I went in PowerShell. And his big mantra was, be the tool maker, not the tool user. And that really shines up here. So I know that I'm probably, a pretty good level 4. But whenever I'm writing PowerShell, my idea is not how do I get the job done so much as how do I make it so somebody else can use this to get the job done. And so then it's more variables instead of hard coded things. It's more, before you try to add something to a site, make sure you're actually connected, things like that. So that's kind of where I see those different things. The other thing that's tough for me on this one, because I haven't fleshed it out, is I know a lot of people who are way better at PowerShell than me. And so I will never see myself as a level 5, because I can always think of 100 other people that know more than me. So that pushes me down. But that's kind of where I see those things, bigger picture things, and thinking about being the tool maker. And like Krista said in the chat, just not being a tool in general is always good.
Todd, don't sell yourself short on the whole level 5 thing. That's our job to sell you short. Please don't. You're stepping on our toes there a little bit. I did have a question that's Todd plus developers really, and does level 5 entail, or is there a place up there somewhere in that rarefied air for encapsulating PowerShell or wrapping code around PowerShell to automate it even further?
So you're thinking of things like the Azure Functiony stuff, or what are you thinking?
Sure, yeah, or just or any sort of app that calls PowerShell that's stored somewhere and it's my routine for doing things. Is that a hallmark of high maturity or not? Because if you're a developer, you'd probably do it other ways.
Yeah, well, so I think it would be maybe the other way around, whereas
Okay.
I would, because inside of PowerShell you can do REST calls and things like that. So then it would be, there's not a PowerShell commandlet that does the thing that I want, but I read some documentation, developer documentation, there's a REST endpoint exposed or something like that, and making PowerShell to ping off of those things. But I think Julie would consider it a failure if she ever had to work code into a project. Now she uses it to configure things and all that, but I can't imagine it would be part of the solution.
I think where it really, a lot of people especially in IT departments who feel like they don't have enough time in the day, is because they're like, I've got to download that Excel file again because it's Tuesday, or the users always want me to run this report for them, or I have to check the audit log to see if we've had any intrusions, that sort of stuff. If you can automate some of that stuff, then you can move on to some more higher level activity.
Yeah.
And you have PowerShell running that you trust, that you've stolen from Todd, and you're automating enough so that you can then spend your time on some of these higher level things. I think that's the other way to think about it. It's not that your PowerShell skills go up, just that these PowerShell skills go up the chain, which they do, but also the way your organization ends up working will be better off if repeatable functions are automated and you can trust that they're going to happen.
Yeah, and I, as an IT pro, especially right now we're kind of post cloud now, but certainly there's some years where IT pros didn't know what their jobs were going to look like. And so they would cling on to things as much as they can, and we still get it once in a while. But I'm with you. Like, as soon as I can automate something and take something off of what I'm doing, that gives me a chance to learn something funner and cooler. And so yeah, that's absolutely how I see this.
Todd, before we go to, go ahead, Emily, please.
Yeah, just the one last comment on that maturity model. So while we were talking through this in our prep, we kept using my former organization where I was, because I used to be a solo platform owner. And whenever we're looking at the maturity model, it depends where you need to be by your organization. So for me, I didn't necessarily need to know and be at this 400, 500 level, because I had a great partner I could reach out to when I needed the help. But the biggest thing I use it for, right, is to do that automation of the site templates, which we talked about last session. And if I had PnP provisioning templates then, I would have spent so much more time on that strategic work, to Mark's point too, which would have been fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. So before we do the what's new, Todd, I did want to ask, are there any best practices that we espouse around source code management? Where do you store it? How do you store it? How do you maintain it?
Yeah, this has been a big change for me over the last 2 or 3 years, especially coming on board here at Praxis. Before that, my source code was, opening files in Notepad or Notepad++ if I was really, wanting to look good, and saving them to OneDrive. It was horrible. But I can say that as a non-developer, the whole GitHub and VS Code experience is pretty good, and I really don't like not using it. And so VS Code gives me a good environment for creating things, and then also gives me that hook into GitHub, and then GitHub is the source repository. And that I've definitely done things where I've needed to roll back versions and see what I did before. So yeah, it's less scary than it sounds. Yeah, I think that's all the IT pros that play with PowerShell should be using VS Code and GitHub.
That's another higher level maturity thing, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Cool.
Hey, Todd.
All right, let's talk. Go ahead.
Sorry, it's Sherm here.
Yeah.
What would be great is if you had one of these sessions about GitHub and kind of a primer on getting our stuff, because I'm with you. I'm still on the OneDrive model where I have all my scripts and there's no versioning, of course, blah, blah, blah. Well, not true versioning. So it'd be great if you could do something on GitHub, because that area, to be quite honest, still kind of scares me. And this is coming from someone who used to use Visual Studio Teams, right? Way back in the day.
Yeah,
Emily, do you want to plug sharing is caring for people who are new to GitHub?
Yeah, so there is a session that you can join for free. with the Sharing is Caring team, where it's about, I believe, an hour and a half, and they actually create a fake repo so you can practice pull requests and things like that live. And there's a couple different levels. So I do recommend that, and I'll put that in the chat in addition to, I can see how Todd might have some additional points to expand on that.
Cool. I just found that. I just did a search for Sharing is Caring GitHub. Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. You're welcome. That's how I learned.
And
ahead,
that's
Todd.
something.
5 minutes.
Oh, geez. So the whole reason that we talked about the other stuff was because the prime module, and somebody asked earlier that I do most of my work with these days, is the PNP PowerShell module. And I've been a big fan of that for 100 years now. That's nothing new. But starting last month, they made a really big change, and that's kind of what we wanted to get out here. They kind of put a line in the sand with the old module, which was the SharePoint PowerShell Online something PNP. I forget what the name was. It's like 7 words all scrambled around. That module, rock solid, but not going to be developed anymore. Starting last month, there's a new module out that is pnp.powershell, and I really should have had it on this slide. And that is moving forward, what they're going to use. And that's kind of what we wanted to come out with today was now is the time to start moving your stuff over and stop using the old PNP module and use the new PNP module. That kind of thing is scary. So we wanted to put a couple of nuggets here on why you should do that. The big change is authentication. So the old module, and it came out, I don't remember, 3, 4, 5 years ago, has SharePoint right in the name. It authenticated right against SharePoint. You did SharePointy things and everything was good. These days, you can't get away with that because you've got, teams that connect in here. So you've got these Microsoft 365 groups and Planner, all these other places. And authenticating directly against SharePoint doesn't get you where you need to go. And so with the last module, they kind of added some ways. And if you needed to do this, you had to authenticate that way. And it was a huge mess. So with PNP PowerShell now, the graph APIs, the delegated APIs that you use to connect are the primary way to get in. They are the first-class citizen. That gets you your SharePoint work and all the other things. So now you can be a proper Microsoft 365 admin. A little scary, a little extra work up front, but then it gets you into everything. And then like Julie talked about earlier, now it's not Windows only. So the old module ran on Windows PowerShell, was based on .NET, whatever, Windows only, you don't care. But the new one runs on any platform that PowerShell runs on. So we're talking Azure Functions, Macs, Linux boxes, Raspberry Pis, whatever. You can run the PNP PowerShell and it works everywhere.
I can attest to that. It runs great on my Mac.
There you go. Yeah. And so I put a couple of resources down there. Those of you, there's a lot of familiar faces in the chat here, know that I do love any opportunity to pimp my blog. So here you go. Those are 2 recent blog posts that I've put in about getting the new module and moving, code bases like that's kind of scary. So there's a couple of blog posts there on how to keep the old module so your old scripts work without breaking anything, but get the new module, how to get them to coexist on your machine without causing any problems. Julie posted a pretty good blog post yesterday or the day before in getting a dev tenant in Microsoft 365. I did the Petri thing yesterday, and one of the people was like, I love this PowerShell thing, but I'm afraid to try this in my production tenant. That's a good fear.
Awesome.
That's a sign of maturity. Put a little tear right there. So Julie's blog post on getting a dev tenant, which I've got a blog post that links to her blog post, so click mine first, will give you a tenant so that you can go off with reckless abandon.
Just for that, damn
it. So that'll give you a little bit of, you can do things and break things, and it's all good. The PNP home for that PowerShell is right there, so get in there. Maturity model, I think that's what I got.
Is that enough times?
Well, I got to give these all angry faces, and the more you put, the tougher. That just
working hard. Emily, go.
We could have probably created a PowerShell script to just post that every 3 seconds or so, right?
I'll have it the afternoon. So one funny story that I love to tell. I used to work at a place on a SharePoint team. And somebody sent a thing out one day, hey, is there a way to do blah, blah? Nobody responded. So like an hour later, he was all mad. He's like, what? Nobody's going to help. And then somebody else on the team responds, well, in cases like this, you should do what I do. You should instead post and say, there's no way to do this in PowerShell. And then just sit back and wait for Todd to prove you wrong. And that like when he did that, I'm like, yeah, that is absolutely me. Oh my God. But that's just, I love it.
To Lou and Patrick's comment about the E5 being included in the dev tenant, good segue to our next topic in 2 weeks, talking about Viva, some of the new capabilities from Microsoft around the employee experience. Some of those were components in Cortex, and I believe will be licensed under the E5. So 2 weeks from today, we'll be talking about the recent announcements from Microsoft about Viva and our take on it. That'll be 2 weeks from today, Wednesday the 24th. Todd, any closing remarks? I know we're just about at time here.
Yeah. So my closing remarks would be: get out there, be curious, try this out. You'll be glad that you did. And again, I see a lot of familiar faces in the chat room. Y'all know I'm pretty accessible, so don't be afraid to hit me up on Twitter, send me an email message. Contrary to a lot of folks, I do like dumb questions because I found they're really easy for me to answer. So don't be afraid.
Makes him look good.
It does. It makes me look brilliant.
Makes you feel good about yourself.
It does, So don't be worried about any of that. I'm always happy to help however I can.
So I got
thank you everybody for
question real quick.
Oh, yes,
for
please.
Todd.
Yeah.
So on the new PMP module, were you saying that making the calls on the PMP commands that involve graph are easier now, or you still need to set up your app?
So
all that stuff.
Yeah, you need to set the app up, and so what Lou's talking about is the register of the enterprise application in Azure. It's easier now. They had a tool that did it in the old one. The new one's a little better. But what is easier is not running into problems where you don't have permission. So with the old one, it was very easy to log in a way where you could do a bunch of things in SharePoint, but then as soon as you try to touch a Microsoft 365 group, you get access denied, and you don't know why, because you were just touching that site 30 seconds ago. So once you get that registration used or created in the new one, then it's much smoother.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks, Lou. Thank you everybody for your questions, for your chat, for busting Todd's chops. We all need more of that. And thanks to Todd for the content and the team for pulling together. I think that's it for this week, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.